If some things have become more clear over the past week, why is it that you might also feel less certain? Maybe you're more clear about what doesn't fit anymore, what you don't want, what you can't simply ignore the way you used to. But instead of that clarity giving you a perfectly obvious next step, as we go into this eclipse, you may actually be feeling more uncertainty. On the surface, those can look like separate contradicting experiences. But what if they're actually part of the same process? If you're new here, I'm Katya. For more than a decade, I have worked closely with people during periods of deep internal change, helping them understand what those shifts are actually asking of them. And in this video, I'm going to clarify 3 things. First, why you may feel less certain right now, even though some things have become so much clearer. Second, why this stage of the August 27-28 eclipse corridor is putting so much pressure on the things that are no longer feeling aligned. And third, 2 important questions we need to be asking as we move through this eclipse if we want to understand what we're being invited to do next and who we're being invited to become. That third piece is probably the most important one as we enter this phase, so stick with me to the end for that. And for now, let's dive right in. In my last video, you'll find it on my channel, I talked about how this strange quiet after the August 12th eclipse worked to help turn down the competing noise around us, like some of the usual distractions got quieter. And for many people, that made something underneath all of it easier to hear. But once you can hear something clearly, that doesn't mean you're done. That's where another phase begins. Because sometimes the thing that's become clear doesn't fit into the life or the structure you've already organized around it. And that's exactly where we are now. The astrological landscape changed quite noticeably last week. The sun left Leo and entered Virgo, and Mercury just entered Virgo as well, a sign that astrologers tell us emphasizes discernment, details, accuracy, usefulness, and noticing precisely what fits and what doesn't anymore. So the collective mental atmosphere becomes much more interested in what is actually true here? What works? What doesn't? What have I overlooked? What needs to be adjusted? And today, August 26th, several very specific aspects are present that can make it feel like things are not arriving in perfectly packaged answers, while at the same time feeling like something needs adjustment. And in this case, where 2 things that don't naturally fit together must try and find a new relationship. And this is exactly where so many of my clients, perhaps many of you listening, and even myself and people in my life have found ourselves right now. You know something, but what you know doesn't neatly fit inside the plan you already had. It can feel like knowing you don't want something in quite the same way anymore, but you don't yet know what replaces it. You may see a relationship, a project, a role with more clarity or accuracy now, and feel uncomfortable with what that clarity implies. Something you were completely certain about just 3 months ago, you may suddenly be doubting a little. Or you may simply find yourself thinking, I know more than I did 2 weeks ago, so why do I feel less certain about moving forward? And here's the missing piece that can make this phase feel kind of like trying to drive with 1 foot on the gas and 1 foot on the brake at the same time. It's that knowing what is no longer true and knowing the final shape of what comes next are 2 completely different stages. And what makes it feel uncomfortable is that the mind wants to collapse them into one. It thinks, if I'm clear, I should already know exactly what to do. But that's not necessarily how change works. Our perception often updates first, while the structure that supports it takes longer to form. Imagine you've been driving somewhere using a map you've relied on for years. It's accurate. It got you there. You know exactly which road to take, and then one day you discover that the road itself has changed. There's a new turn. A road that used to continue no longer does. Maybe an entirely different route has opened. When that happens, staring harder at the old map isn't going to make you feel more oriented. You're going to become more confused, not because you suddenly suck at navigation or that you've lost your intuitive guidance. It's just that the map isn't reflecting the new terrain. And that's what this particular phase can feel like. That uncertainty isn't necessarily evidence that you've lost your direction. It might be evidence that your internal map isn't yet reflecting a landscape that has already changed. And this becomes even more interesting when we look at the eclipse that we're approaching. We've already moved into the new Leo Aquarius nodal cycle, the new collective evolutionary chapter that astrologers have been talking about. And this lunar eclipse is completing an eclipse storyline that actually began back in 2024. So that's why you may feel like you're already standing inside the new chapter. And this eclipse is effectively reaching backwards to close something from the previous one. That's why so many astrologers are highlighting this Virgo Pisces influence now. Virgo wants to discern, to understand, to organize, to improve, to make sense of things, where with Pisces, not everything becomes clear through more control or more analysis. There are things we need to perceive. There are things we have to allow. There are places where another 5 hours of thinking will not create an answer that hasn't taken form yet. So I'm not suggesting the best question is, should I analyze this or give it up completely? The one I'm suggesting is, can I discern what is true without trying to control what the answer has to look like? And that's different. And if your mind is working overtime right now, trying to solve everything, you don't need to make that wrong either. The mind often starts analyzing harder when something we used to rely on no longer feels stable. It's trying to restore orientation. So it can sound like, if I can just figure this out, if I can get enough information, if I can just make the pieces fit, then I'll feel grounded again. Then I'll feel certain. But there's one problem. More analysis cannot make an outdated structure become aligned again. Sometimes the discomfort isn't inviting you to find a better argument for the old direction or the old way of being. It's inviting you to ask yourself whether the direction itself needs to change. And that's the fork in the road I see many of us standing in right now. One part says, how do I make the new awareness fit into everything I've already built or decided? How do I keep the plan, the role, the relationship, the identity, the expectation, and somehow accommodate this new information without changing very much? And the other part asks something much less comfortable. What if what I've realized is actually inviting me to reconsider what I've been doing or who I've been showing up as? Those questions can sound almost identical. They're not. One asks the new truth to fit the old map. The other allows the map to change because the terrain has changed. And even through the lens of numerology, August 26th carries an interesting parallel. 2026 is a universal 1 year, the beginning of a new 9-year cycle. 9 is associated with endings, culmination, and completion. And August is a universal 9-month. So there's a lot of 9 energy. And August 26th is a universal 8-day. 8 is a number traditionally associated with consequence, responsibility, power, and what happens when something becomes real enough that we have to take it seriously. So even through the numerology, we are sitting inside this strange sequence of something beginning, something completing, and the responsibility of deciding what we actually carry from one phase into the other. And that becomes even more pronounced over the next few days. But here's another layer to this unique corridor that's adding another twist. Right before the eclipse arrives, something fascinating starts to unfold astrologically. First, on August 27th, something astrologers call a cazimi arrives, this time with Mercury, as it meets the sun in Virgo, which is traditionally associated with illumination, awareness, and things becoming mentally clearer. Next, only hours later, we move into the Pisces lunar eclipse. And eclipses magnify and amplify. And then finally, on the 28th, two of what astrologers call a square arrive and click into position, creating this feeling of tension. It's called a square, so think there's four sides, much like a box. And many people interpret this as a feeling of pressure, and particularly now around needing to rearrange things. So we are headed into a window where perception, information, assumptions, and plans may not remain arranged exactly the way they were before. I'm not suggesting, though, that this is something to worry about, but it does suggest that we are approaching a beautiful invitation to notice what has become difficult to keep seeing the way you once did. So here's the practice I would give you for the days ahead. This builds on what we did last week, but you can also simply start from here. Choose an area of your life where something has been changing internally, and ask yourself these two questions. Number one, what have I become unable to ignore over the last 2 weeks? Not what you think you're supposed to change. What has genuinely become harder to explain away? What do you see differently or more clearly now? What way of being, perhaps, no longer feels possible to overlook? And then ask, number two, what part of my current plan, my current way of being, only works if I dismiss what has become clear? Or only works if I pretend I don't know what I now know? That's the harder question. And for most people, the more uncomfortable one. Now, you don't have to solve this today. You don't necessarily have to even take action on it either. But this week, I would seriously invite you to stop negotiating with the fact that you're aware of it. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't immediately knowing what comes next. It's being honest about the fact that what worked before may not fit the same way anymore. And if it feels uncomfortable or hard to admit, perhaps it's time to start asking why. So this is where many of us are now. Last week, the invitation was, notice what became clearer when the old momentum got quiet. And this week, the invitation is progressing. It's, can you let what you now know change your map? Because uncertainty doesn't necessarily mean you've lost your direction. From what I've seen in my work with others and even in my own life, so often it's the direction that we've been following that may simply no longer be able to support who we're becoming. So over the next few days, carry these questions with you. And remember, you don't need to force the new map into existence. It will start to emerge as things settle and integrate within you. But I wouldn't keep following the old map simply because it's familiar or because it feels too uncomfortable to consider a new map. Let your life show you what has actually completed. Let the clarity arrive naturally before trying to restructure things. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening. I'd love to hear what has become harder for you to ignore, and if you're finding it easy or hard to allow that new map to surface right now. So leave a comment below. And if you found this kind of grounded orientation supportive, feel free to subscribe. I'm Katya, and I'll see you in the next one.